everyone, and thank you for coming in this lovely Saturday afternoon. I'm Cosmin Costinach. I am the director and curator of Parasite, which is an art space in Chenois, in Emporium Street. And it's a space that for many years now has been organizing exhibitions of contemporary art and also trying this effort of bringing artists and curating exhibitions to contextualize both from an art historical perspective and from a theoretical perspective and from a perspective of art criticism, the exhibitions that we do. So in this regard, we organize a lot of talks and screenings and other discursive projects of that kind. So, because I see a lot of new faces, I would warmly like to invite you to visit Parasite and the space we have there. The next major discursive event that we're organizing is actually an international conference bringing together artists, curators, and theorists from all over the world that will take place on the 11th, 12th, and 13th of April. So at the end of the talk, if you're interested in getting more information about Parasite, about the conference and our other programs, just leave either your business card or write down your email address in the notebook over there. So this afternoon's talk is also organized in conjunction with an exhibition. As I mentioned, this is our main mode of working. And I would like to invite my colleague Chinyi Ling, who's actually the curator of the exhibition that generated this talk, to Android Stream of Electric Sheep, the paradox of choice in a time of anxiety, which has in fact finished. We have another exhibition on at the moment, so this is a kind of echo parallel event of the exhibition. But yes, I invite Chinyi to tell us more about the premises behind making that exhibition and the way in which that relates with Renata's work, and then to properly introduce Renata and to give her the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to address, we have another event on Wednesday as well. So we're having a talk and screening program looking at the colonial archives called Camping and Tramping Through the Colonial Archive. This will be held at 6:30 at AA at the A space, as well as 8 p.m. the screening at Parasite. So if you're around and would like to have a look at colonial archives, do come by too. But with regards to the exhibition, the premise of the exhibition was mainly drawn from Renata's work with the idea of the ideology of choice. So looking at the politics of anxiety mainly, and how to reflect that, and how does that work within contemporary art. I mean, one of the main things that often conditioned our practice in exhibition making is the question of locality and urgency. So in terms of urgency of doing an exhibition, how does that deal with Hong Kong as a whole? Like, one of the research was also re-looking at the idea of the consumer confidence index within Hong Kong itself, which plunged in 2005 and then subsequently in 2008 again. And this was sort of the starting point of the exhibition, where it started looking at deciphering consumers' choice, consumers' value system before looking at different ideologies and how did it work, what worked, figuring out the world around it. So I'm very honored to have Renata here today, because her work has been largely instrumental behind the research of the exhibition itself, as sort of the genesis and the starting point of everything. And without further ado, if you don't mind, I'm just going to give a brief bio of Renata, because she's one of many hats. And just to introduce her, Renata is the senior researcher at the Institute of Criminology at the Faculty of Law, Ljubljana in Slovenia. She also teaches at the School of Law in Burbank College, and also is a visiting professor at the Patterson School of Law. And recently she's been Her works has been translated into Chinese in terms of tyranny of choice and on anxiety itself. So without further ado, please welcome Renata.
For the invitation. I'm sorry I missed the exhibition, and I urge you to definitely see the one that is currently at Parasite. I'm also glad that here are some of your philosophers and colleagues working in theoretical psychoanalysis here, so we are globally, it looks, thinking kind of similar issues. And what I will share today with you is work I have done after my book on choice, and it's sort of a project which is leading to a new book which I hope will come out soon, and it's kind of taking further the anxiety that we are having over the sort of ideological changes that we experience in today's society. I have always been interested in how the malaise of civilization and the malaise of individual influence each other. We know from work of Sigmund Freud that social changes very much influence the type of suffering people are experiencing, the type of symptoms they are forming, and we can say that with the changes of suffering of people, of course, we also have social changes. I'm sure that in your society, a lot of the work is probably done about the changes you are experiencing here, since you are definitely at the forefront of the kind of a consumer work-related society that we are all, living in. And I'm sure also that in the mainland China, interesting work is probably done about the social changes there, and in particular what I have also read in sort of the public media in Europe, there's interesting, debates about even the family life, the one-child policy, the so-called emperor-child, and the problems, of course, of new narcissism. Now, what I will tackle today is, therefore, this kind of the problems of the undersides of ideology of choice. We already heard about anxiety being importantly linked to choice. One of my ideas in my book on the tyranny of choice was also that very crucial for today's society is the feeling of guilt and the feeling of inadequacy. So the fact that we are constantly feeling that we are not actually satisfied with our choices, or that we are trying to figure out how to prevent future risks, how to avoid loss, how to make an ideal choice, and that we are feeling personally responsible for very basic choices like about our health, body, or even emotions. All this in some way creates the feeling of guilt, anxiety, and inadequacy, which pacifies the subjectivity today. And it actually prevents us to think about choice in terms of social choices. So the fact that we are constantly turning inwards, that we are constantly critiquing ourselves, creates a kind of a perfect subject, a subject who is, subordinated to the dominant capitalist ideology. Now, Jacques Lacan, in his work, pointed out that self-destruction is very much aligned with the way capitalism functioned. In the last years, there had been a growing interest in one of his lectures that he delivered in early 70s in Milan, when he was pointing out that capitalism elevates the subject in the position of the master. Although the subject is still a proletarian slave, the subject nonetheless lives under the illusion that he or she is actually a master, especially a master of his or her life. So one of the intriguing points of Lacan was that in capitalism we have a system where we are working more and more, we are also consuming more and more, but at some point we start consuming ourselves. Which is why if you look at the symptoms which we are still suffering from, especially symptoms related to our body, anorexia, bulimia, various forms of addictions, even self-cutting, we can see that kind of a self-destruction as being part of the very way, people suffer today. So if society is creating, sort of new symptoms, and the symptoms which, as mentioned, have existed before, but they have sort of escalated in some way, we can also say that on top of this individual type of violence towards ourselves, towards our own body, of course, we can see the emergence of all kinds of other, violences in the way, of course, social violence, on top of kind of political uprisings. There are also moments of distractions that we can observe in social sphere, which are linked to the way capitalism functions. So I will look at this both two sides of sort of sufferings and aggressions that we can observe. Now I will also look at the problem of how an identification with the ideology of choice sort of in some way created psychological symptoms. On the other hand, it created a certain kind of violence, social violence, but also it opened up a certain kind of a space for art to reflect those symptoms, to reflect also the antagonisms that exist in society, of course, in its own way. Now, if I start with the latest, since we are in sort of space related to art, let me sort of go through a kind of a little bit humorous start. About a little bit over a year ago in the United States, there was a big debate in the public media over a big figure of Lego that ended up on the beaches of Florida. Now, this giant Lego man who appeared one morning, became a sensation for a few days. When the joggers saw this figure, they first thought that maybe this Lego man fell down from a ship which is sort of transporting Lego men from one Lego land to another. Now, immediately a kind of a paranoia emerged that maybe this Lego man is sort of like a kind of a pollution of the beach, that someone, on purpose dropped this plastic on the beach, and because they have very strict law about dropping plastic, local mayor was immediately informed. Now, journalists started kind of questioning where this, Lego man would come from. Of course, some people had fun with it, but, very soon the local sheriff put this Lego man into a special zone, kind of a prison, I guess, for Guantanamo prison for Lego men. Now, as soon as this Lego man ended up in prison, and he had a very interesting writing on it, a Facebook page was created, which was sort of saying "Free Lego Man," and a big debate about the human rights of Lego men started. It was really as if Lego man became, sort of like a prisoner. We are all fighting for his release. Now, after a little bit more research, the journalist discovered that something similar happened already before. It happened a couple of years ago on the Brighton beach in Britain. It happened also sort of in other places, the giant Lego man appearing. And of course, with a bit more research, they figured out that this has been sort of related to artwork of an artist from Netherlands, Leon Kerr, who very soon was about to appear in a chalk art sort of festival in Florida. So in a couple of days from the question of is this kind of a paranoid attack on our beaches, to the discussion about the human rights of Lego man and so on, when the Lego man became just sort of an art object, the public interest really stopped, and it appeared like as a kind of a smart, a bit naughty advertising of a particular artist. Now, at the very same moment in New York, they had another debate going on about the question of what can be art and what is actually violence. An artist, not very known, Marty Kotak, decided to give birth in a public gallery, like maybe Parasite. Maybe you can do it in the future here, but okay. she had done in Brooklyn Gallery, which also was not very known but before her project. Now she decided the last month of her pregnancy to spend many hours every day in the gallery with her husband. They also created a lot of objects in case they will need to sell something. You know, you never know when you might need money. You know, they were doing exercises, pre-birthing, breathing, and so on, and people were coming to the gallery to observe this couple, you know, preparing for the biggest art event of their life, giving birth to baby X. Now, when she got contractions, she sort of emailed the first 20 people on the long list of people who wanted to be part of this exceptional art performance. She invited them to the group, to the room, and during this, you know, practice of giving birth, people were tweeting all around that this was the best art event they ever have seen in their life. Now, of course, debate also started whether giving birth can actually be perceived as art. And, you know, people said if, you know, killing some animal or at least playing in other ways with violence can be perceived as work of art, we can also perceive, you know, giving birth as work of art. Of course, another debate started whether, you know, giving birth in a public place is actually an act of violence against the future child, because the future child immediately becomes perceived as an art object. And those who want to follow how this art object is developing, you can look at the webpage of Marnie Kotak, because now she's recording the life of this art object, and it's called sort of Raising Baby X. So every step in the life of this child will be, you know, an art event. Now, when 13 years ago, I gave birth to my son, Tim. Actually, when he was a tiny little baby, I remember walking down the streets of Slovenia in Ljubljana, and a famous Slovenian artist stopped me and he looked at the child and he said, "Wow, this is your art object." And I said, "Why? This is a child." He said, "No, no, no. Now we can perceive this child as a genetic sculpture." So we can see that in some ways, you know, when we have a certain kind of ideological setting, something, even genes or genetic sculpture, can be perceived as work of art. And we know very well from contemporary arts that we have reflected in other ways this turn to see the inside of the body, the genes, the brain, and so also with artistic means. Now, let me move sort of further to the ideological changes. So if particular ideological changes allow us also to reshape what is art and what isn't, we can say that ideological changes very much shape also, you know, our subjectivity, particularly how we sort of regard ourselves, not only how we regard body of our child as genetic sculpture, as an art object, or even a biological event like giving birth as an art practice, even our own bodies, you know, the way we perceive ourselves is hugely shaped by the ideological space around us. Now, let us stay with the question of how we look ourselves in the mirror. Now, looking ourselves in the mirror has never been an easy thing. We know from Greek mythology the story of Narcissus, you know, the fact that he couldn't stop observing himself in the lake, you know, at the end costed him his life. Now we can say that we have a rather opposite problem. It's not that we cannot sort of stop looking ourselves in the mirror. Quite often we cannot look at ourselves in the mirror. Many forms of anorexia involve that anxiety over looking ourselves in the mirror. For example, many anorexic women would not be able to watch themselves in the mirror because they perceive themselves in the mirror always tremendously fat. Now, I also have quite a sort of large friend who actually has the opposite problem. She always perceives herself in the mirror as rather thinner than she is, which is why she always buys clothes much smaller than needed. Now, my Japanese friend, psychoanalyst Daisuke Fukuda, who is practicing Lacanian psychoanalysis in Tokyo, recently told me about the story of one of his patients, a Japanese girl, who is breaking every mirror that comes next to her. So she cannot watch in the mirror, but she also cannot stand any mirror around her. So immediately she breaks the mirror in her apartment or anywhere else. Now, this woman in some way is suffering from a very particular symptom, which is in some way linked to the ideological changes that Japanese society sort of experienced in regard to body image. Japanese girls now are obsessed with changing their bodies, and I'm sure that you're experiencing similar things here and also in mainland China, and in Europe we have a long history also trying to change our bodies. So in Japan, a lot of girls now, get everywhere free newspapers offering them a complete body change. Sort of like it's like a consumer thing, you can get coupons for a discount for plastic surgery, or you can get 3 types of plastic surgeries for the price of 1 or 2, all kinds of the machinery that operates otherwise in consumption. Now, if until, now Japanese culture actually sort of tries to convince people to embrace their appearance, now body is more and more becoming perceived as a matter of choice. Now, of course, we cannot take an emergence of psychological symptom like, this problem with the image that this girl has as simply a reflection of the changes of ideology. So we need to be clear that every individual always forms sort of symptoms in his or her own way. However, the ideological setting we live in contributes to the type of symptoms people form. Now, from our early childhood, the way we see ourselves in the mirror is always influenced by others around us and by culture in general. When the baby goes through the well-known mirror stage, it is essential that he or she identifies with his or her image via the speech of primary caregiver. So it is usually the mother or whoever is the primary caregiver who urges the baby to recognize him or herself in the mirror. So from Lacanian psychoanalysis, we know that, when we are observing ourselves in the mirror, someone has to be next to us who says, baby, this is you. And it is only after that sort of symbolic language that we are able to sort of recognize this rather alien image in the mirror as ourselves. Now, authority figures around us, our parents and society in general, also soon start functioning as particular kind of mirrors in which we observe ourselves. Now, when social perceptions about body change, we also start observing ourselves differently. Susie Orbach, British psychoanalyst who specializes in body problems, especially anorexia, and she was also, psychoanalyst of Princess Diana in the past. She wrote a very interesting book called The Bodies, Bodies, and in this book, Susie describes a case of one of her patients, a man who's been employed in financial services in Britain, but he had a strange habit that he always walked naked in his apartment, in pretty much in any place, not a public place, but whenever it was possible, he wanted to be completely naked. Now, this guy, of course, suffered because of this. He had to be dressed in the public, but in private, he loved to be just naked. Now, through analysis of this guy, it came out that he was raised when he was very young in Africa. His family lived near a particular tribe, which was, sort of naked, and the boy was often left alone to play with the children from the tribe. And when he was growing up, he had a completely different attitude towards nakedness as Western children. When the family went back to Britain, he had to sort of learn to kind of appear in dress, but still had an imprint of that kind of a nakedness from early childhood. Now, we can say that, another important part when we observe the bodily changes around us is, of course, how society, ideology perceives, sort of body shape. And from, countries like Papua New Guinea, interesting research comes which shows that with this country having more and more access to the Western media, they also immediately now have an increase in the sort of body suffering that people have in the West, like anorexia, bulimia, the obsession with thinness. Although even some decades ago, their ideal of beauty was a woman who is a little bit larger. Now the ideal is becoming, kind of a starved, zero kind of body shape. The body shape of the thinnest kind of a model that we see from the media. Now, in times dominated by ideology of choice, it appears that an individual might actually choose also today not only a body he or she wants to be in, a shape of body, but also a mirror in which he or she wants to look at him or herself. And here, interesting artwork, of course, comes from the well-known Anish Kapoor, who has been playing with the mirrors throughout, his career. And, in one of the exhibitions in London, there were mirrors where you could see yourself as tall or big, small, fat, thin, whatever. And outside there were also mirrors where you could see reality in a different way. Now, when we see the art sort of kind of reflecting the changes, ideological changes, one of the most interesting exhibitions about sort of the current anxieties over choice for me was an exhibition which was sort of like a year and a half ago in London. The title of the exhibition was New Sensations. It was organized by Sarchi Gallery and Channel 4. And at this exhibition, I saw the artwork of Julia Fogel. Julia Fogel asked people who came to the exhibition to choose a tag which sort of says why they came to the exhibition. I came for the drink, I'm a friend of an artist, I just came by. I was a bit greedy, I took all of them because I kind of liked all colors. And the next object she had was the sort of, I thought, linked to anxieties that we have over germs. So whenever you have an anxiety, you can choose a different soap or a different sort of kind of object to disinfect yourself. If you're afraid, of germs from other people, you can choose the color or whatever, the toilet or whatever. I thought that really reflects wonderful the anxiety sort of over our bodies today. Another exhibition, another sort of artist at this show, which intrigued me, was Jeremy Hutchinson. Now, Jeremy Hutchinson, touched some kind of an ideological problem of today's society, which is sort of the problem of perfection and failure. Now, Jeremy asked numerous producers around the world, and mostly in mainland China, to create an object which they usually are producing with the failure. And it should be the worker in the assembly line who chooses what kind of a failure the object will have. Now, you can imagine not many factories really wanted to accept this challenge, but some did. So we got shoes you cannot put on, glasses you cannot see through. Of course, you can't put on this hat. This trumpet probably would not work very well. I don't know if kids would like this object. I'm sure workers would love this because they will not need to work. And this was the kind of a typical letter which he wrote was, I want to buy your project with a failure. But usually he got the response like, thanks for your inquiry, we cannot accept the challenge. Or another typical letter was, how dare you ask us for a failed object? We only produce perfect things. There is no failure in our factory. Now, what Jeremy Hutchins touched very much was certain kind of an obsession with perfection and the inability actually to deal with failure, but also with a kind of a paradoxical idea of choice over what kind of failure that actually should be. Now, today, in some way, we often have the impression that we can sort of create our life the way we want to, that we are free to choose the direction and so on of our life. But paradoxically, this idea of choice has opened the doors to new forms of ignorance. Therefore, it looks that this idea that we have possibilities of possibilities, actually opened up the way that people are more and more actually turning a blind eye towards the possibilities and are opting not to see things. Now, so why is it that in the midst of all the endless possibilities, people opt for ignorance? Especially in regard to the fact that, they have actually maybe possibilities to also change the ideology around them. How come that in some way passion for ignorance is sort of like quite a dominant passion we are living through today? Now, when societies are experiencing changes, we can observe the changes in the way people start looking at themselves. It is as if the mirror in which they have been observing themselves has changed, and therefore they start observing themselves differently. Now let us look at the sort of problem with authorities. If we perceive authorities as a particular kind of mirror in which we look ourselves on the daily basis, try to identify with them or oppose them, search for recognition of them, and so on, we can observe a change happening in which society today, actually gives authorities a different role. Now, when, for example, the ideology encourages to stop looking at authorities, but rather look at ourselves as the ultimate masters, we might become, at some point, indifferent towards what others think about us, or we might also become indifferent how our behavior affects others. But the ignorance towards others and towards society at large in today's society is also shifting towards some kind of an ignorance towards ourselves. So contemporary narcissism is in a paradoxical way today auto-destructive. It is not that the individual is primarily centered on his or her well-being. Paradoxically, in the midst of all the information that people have about their well-being, they are more and more ignoring it. Let me return to the case of Japan. Another important information that I learned from my friend Daisuke Fukuda is that after Fukushima, he observed in Tokyo a kind of a split in population. His idea was that about 50% of people were terribly concerned with sort of the effects of Fukushima. They were, looking at the labels of food, where does it come from? Some of them who had the means were thinking about emigrating, while the other 50%, they were ignoring the information. They were often buying food that was produced next to Fukushima, or they were sort of behaving slowly as if nothing really happened. Now, for some of them, you can say they really had no means to escape, to go anywhere else. But even those who had the means or even knowledge, information about the dangers of radiation, they sooner or later started ignoring this danger. Now, a very interesting anecdote about this. In Berlin, I met a Japanese psychoanalyst who pointed to another story. He said that his parents are actually living in a village not too far from Fukushima. And he said that some people from that village actually had a strange idea that they are really, okay, that they are not affected by Fukushima disaster because there is a big mountain between Fukushima and their village. So we can see that we can find ways to ignore things in variety of ways. So even the information we have, we quickly ignore the information and sort of turn a blind eye towards it. Now, when we are questioning the nature of this ignorance, we should remember a famous saying by Jacques Lacan that people actually do not have passion for knowledge, but rather passion for ignorance. Now, this passion leads us to close our eyes and ignore what's to be seen and comprehend. Now, in order to understand the nature of this passion, it is necessary to distinguish between ignorance and repression. When we find something very traumatic, repression usually helps us to at least temporarily establish some distance between what is too painful and sort of our self-perception. Now, when it comes to ignorance, however, we deny that something is traumatic in the first place. A person behaves as if the latter does not concern him or her. It is as if, a kind of foreclosure is at work where the subject is not marked by language. And an individual, therefore, can have all the information on the threat, but will behave as if nothing happened. This kind of ignorance, paradoxically, can contribute to an illusory feeling of all-powerfulness. It appears as if we are actually the masters, even in the midst of sort of the danger. Now, the passion for ignorance is not nowadays appearing in a variety of levels. In spite of continuing economic crisis, most countries behave as if it is just a bad dream with which they will eventually wake up from it and everything will be the same. With ongoing economic problems, and ecological disasters, ecological problems in particular, we are more and more, behaving as if nothing really needs to change. Until very recently, we also had a passion of ignorance in regard to raising social inequality in the developed world. The success of ideology of late capitalism has been that it created the fantasy of possibility even in midst of obvious impossibilities. Even very poor, who have fewer and fewer choices, would paradoxically, passionately support the idea of choice. Now, this absurd thing, for example, very much happened in the United States, where even poor people would not accept universal health care and would sort of embrace the idea of choice of healthcare when actually they didn't have insurance and they had actually no choices to choose from. Now, how come that this passion of ignorance, became so manifest in the last years? And really, how does this passion of ignorance show if we look at social inequality? Here it is interesting to look at research, sort of psychological, economical research that has been done by Dan Ariely and Michael Norton at MIT. They conducted a story on how American people perceive social inequality. So they asked participants of a large survey, how much do they think of all wealth is in the hands of top 20% of people? That was the first question. The second question was the question, what would be the just distribution of wealth? Now, to the first question, the response was that people thought that maybe the top 20% have about 60% of everything in their hands, all the wealth in America. And the just distribution for them would be that they would not have more than 30%. Now, the real answer is that the top 20% have more than 85% of everything, and presumably the top 1% has like more than 40% of everything in their hands. Now, the question, of course, is how come that people do not rebel against something that they obviously perceive as unjust distribution of wealth? When these results came out, New York Times asked sort of like a group of experts from different categories, economists, anthropologists, and so on, for very brief answers why they thought that people are not rebelling against, unjust distribution of wealth. Now, the answers went from the following. One answer was that American people still believe in lottery mentality, which means that people think that maybe in the future they will still make it. Now, the second answer was that, okay, maybe majority of people don't think that they will make it, but they think their children will make it. So they think, okay, my son will maybe become the new Bill Gates, which is why I don't want to impose taxes on the rich. I don't want to tax my future multi-millionaire in my house. The third answer was that people actually more strongly identify with people who are similar to them, like their colleagues, neighbors and they're envious towards them, the wealth that they have, and not really towards the super rich, because the super rich live the life so outside of their sort of life, that's why they don't even have jealousy towards them. Now the fourth answer was that people nowadays have more feeling of guilt towards themselves, that they are feeling that they are guilty for overspending, going in debt, and they are not sort of looking that society encouraged them to accumulate this debt, so that individual guilt for financial troubles pacifies a lot of people. The fifth type of answer was that many middle-class people actually have the impression that they actually are not doing so badly if they compare themselves with their parents, because they possess much more gadgets, and their lives appear to be better, especially in regard to kind of the gadgets they have. I'm sure, this is probably similarly observed here, because you are really the capital of gadgets. Now, at a time of crisis, the sixth answer was that there is often with the people not so much a desire to have as there is a desire to keep. So we are afraid of losing something, not so much maybe to have in some way more. Now, to the list of these responses, I think one needs to add the explanation that the belief in choice in some way has been in a paradoxical way also supplemented with the idea of chance, which has sort of created a certain belief in ideology that everyone can make it. And I would also add to this list that we are living in times of a certain kind of a democratization of luxury, which also opens up new types of identification that are actually preventing social changes, and they are actually preventing people to rebel against the inequalities of wealth. Now let me sort of briefly touch on the problem of chance and choice. Now, the ideology of choice, in a paradoxical way, relies on the idea of chance. Now, chance, of course, is an underside of the idea of capitalism that we live in, but is in some way cherished and perceived as traumatic at the same time. Because if chance offers everyone the possibility to make it, it also presents a kind of an uncontrollable moment that can go against the perception of a rational subjectivity on which the ideology of choice relies. So idea of choice is that we can make rational choices, that we can choose a perfect ideal object, that we can avoid losses related to choice. Anxieties, of course, are very much part of this process of choosing, but in some way this ideology actually doesn't want to deal with the traumatic idea of chance, where we can either lose it or gain it. The idea today has been pretty much that we can only gain. Even in regard to sort of our body, we deny mortality and so on. There is a certain kind of an illusion of continuous present, the denial of death and so on, which is part of this idea of choice and which denies chance. Now, if we look at the negative part of chance, we are quickly reminded, of course, of the most random moment of chance, which can be sort of Russian roulette. But even in Russian roulette, you have sort of choice and chance working at the same time. Now, when Jean-Paul Sartre was sort of thinking about anxiety, he said that anxiety is in some way always related to freedom, and his point was in some way that when we are standing in front of the abyss, the fact that we are free to jump into a abyss, to in some way kill ourselves, is the most anxiety provoking thing in regard to sort of freedom. Now, already in the discussions about anxiety and the possibilities in Kierkegaard's philosophy, we have the idea that the possibility of possibility is incredibly anxiety provoking. And Albert Camus said, very funnily, that every morning when he's waking up, he has, kind of an anxiety-provoking thought whether he should kill himself or have another cup of coffee. Now, we can say that, when we allow randomness to decide ourselves, when we sort of allow something random to decide for our future, that randomness actually, of course, becomes a kind of a new master, which is why chance is so traumatic. I encourage those of you who didn't yet read a very fabulous novel from the 80s, The Dice Man, to look at how this anxiety operates, because in this novel by Luke Reinhardt, we have a psychiatrist who decides at some point that the dice will decide for everything he does in his life. At first, dice was deciding whether, some patient will be released from the hospital or not. He was just throwing the dice. Later, he decided, will he have an affair or not with the throw of dice? Will he divorce? Will he lose his job? And at the end, he kind of ends up on the path of psychotic self-destruction. Now, how traumatic randomness really is happened to me when a year ago at the University of Chicago, a professor of law asked me actually to give a short presentation with him on the trauma of chance. We had an art event on chance and art theory event, and he's a professor of law, Bernard Harcourt. Now, just before the lecture panel we were giving about chance, he and I made an agreement that we will give our paper in a random way. So, Bernard was reading one paragraph of his paper, which we didn't know each other's paper. I was reading a paragraph of my paper. Then he was reading his, mine, and to the end. Now, we told our audience that we are giving a random paper, nothing coordinated. We allow chance to make out of our papers whatever happens. You will not believe it. At the end of our talks, no one believed that it was random. Everyone thought that we wrote the paper together, that everything was coordinated, and that we were just, joking. So you can see that when you're speaking from the position of authority, even then, we don't want to accept certain kind of randomness. Now, the power of randomness I also observed in my own private life when last year a very famous concert happened in Ljubljana by a musician, David Guetta. Now the tickets were the most desirable tickets of that month or year or whatever. My then 12-year-old son, had an extra ticket, and two friends who wanted to go to this concert. They spent endless hours debating who is the best friend, who is the first friend, who is the most loved friends, and whatever. They couldn't come to a conclusion which friend should have this ticket. Then my father intervened and said, let's be sportsmen, let's throw a dice. Let the dice decide. Now, boys were afraid if they throw the dice themselves, this will spoil their friendship. So my father had to throw the dice. When the dice decided, they were able easily to accept this decision. They were able to say that another master really in some way intervened. Now, just briefly, if we look at economic dilemmas and choice and chance today, we can see also a certain denial of chance in the way we perceive stock market. Now, in the 70s, a very interesting book has been published by Burton Malkiel, American economist, entitled A Random Walk Down Wall Street, where he proposed that if we were to have a chimpanzee, blinded chimpanzee, in front of sort of a list of all the stocks, and we will give this chimpanzee a dart to throw into the stocks, his idea was that the stocks that blinded chimpanzee would choose would sort of deliver the same sort of amount of whatever wealth than, the choice of stocks made by the best Wall Street analyzers. Now, the Wall Street Journal actually decided to do this. They didn't use a chimpanzee, but they had a list of stocks, and then they themselves, the journalists, were throwing darts into the stocks, and then they were investing into those randomly picked stocks. Now, at the end, the result of their, choice was actually, again, not much different than the result of all the advisors, who were studying the market. Now, quite often, if we look before now the sort of economic crisis, we had the belief that with the perfect projections, analysis of the market, computer analysis of risks, we can prevent the future disasters, and we can sort of manage the risk of investment almost completely. Now, a special program has been, for some decades now operative called VAR, which was supposed to be 99% accurate in predictions of future sort of stock delivery. Now, after 2008 crash, New York Times, however, wrote that this program is seriously flawed. He said that VAR was a terrible mistake because, the risks that VAR measured did not include the biggest risk of all, the possibility of financial meltdown. Now, whenever we have something 99% accurate, we should always think about that 1%. Now, let's say paradoxically, on the one hand, we have today a certain obsession with prediction and forecasting. And on the other hand, we have a turn to denial. So in regard to market crisis, we have a denial that anything needs to be changed. In regard to ecological crisis, we have a denial that we have any power that we can change something. And we always believe as states that someone else should act first. If you look at the debate between China and the United States about ecological crisis, you always have the other has to act first. China saying, oh, you have been driving these cars for so long, let us enjoy a little bit now, spending too much fuel and so on. America saying, you China, you are polluting everything, you should stop, and so on. Now, denial is also today part of today's consumerism. And sort of let me at the end touch a little bit this, since we are living in a kind of a consumer capital of the world. Hong Kong is definitely on the top of, in the consumption hierarchy. Let me sort of tackle the other problem which I briefly mentioned, which is a certain kind of a painful passion for luxury that we have today and which I think very much pacifies us in its own way. Now, in 2011, we had in London big riots where, as you remember, young people went to the streets and they were looting the shops. Now, it was interesting to see the faces of these young people which sort of appeared in the media. They were captured by the secret cameras. And I was thinking then, when we are debating about happiness in society, they should sort of study these faces and see that, happiness is really linked to looting. Because a lot of people had smiles, especially women, carrying many pairs of shoes from shops, or guys, some sports good or jeans. It was jouissance on the face, as Jacques Lacan would say. You don't need to study Santa Teresa, to study the jouissance. Just, looting. Now, there were two girls who were captured also on sort of camera, even their voices were recording, who were planning to go and, loot some cosmetic stores. And one girl said, let's go to Boots, which is kind of a cheap department store for cosmetics. And the other said, why go to Boots when you can go to Body Shop? And in some way you can see here this identification even of the very poor with luxury brands very much, influence the type of looting. Now, mostly people were looting things from sort of sports, Nike, Adidas, and so on shops. Paradoxically, Nike created a T-shirt even before this, looting, which sort of encourages us to get this shirt without paying for it. Now, a lot of companies using this kind of design and even advertising, which sort of provoked, in some way, transgression, had problem at the time of the looting. The biggest problem happened for the jeans factory Levi's. Now, Levi's, just before the uprising, was planning to release advertising with the title "Go Forth." Now, the image on this advertising was a man dressed in Levi's facing a line of police, with the shields, and underneath it was written "Go Forth." The idea is that a person who wears Levi's goes even against police. Now, if we can see that there was a certain kind of a success related to this advertising which actually encouraged violence, we can see that violence was not happening only on the streets in London at that time. Violence has been in the last year glorified in corporations and large financial institutions. If you look at any manual on management style, you will read about you have to take the scalps of your competitors, kill the opposition, and so on. And we have quite a lot of course, analysis in the domain of psychiatry about, the new type of narcissistic personalities, the CEOs who have no feeling of guilt, who quite, resembles psychopathic criminals, often, with their ignorance towards the pain they are inflicting on others, and sort of their inability to feel any shame or guilt in regard to their own actions. Now, if I sort of finish with this idea of luxury, let me point out that, at the time of London riots, and not only those riots, any sort of other kind of uprising where we observed looting, we saw, of course, this religious love for luxury in all these financiers pretty much buying things from the Montenegrins, and Montenegrins, sort of are enjoying pretty much lying around the beaches for a while. Now, the Montenegrin girls, of course, have a desire to marry some of these newly rich who are walking around their beaches. However, they have developed a perfect strategy of how to do so, which relies on self-restraint. Now, the story Montenegrin girls are telling to each other in regard to how to capture a rich guy goes the following. When a Montenegrin girl meets a rich guy, she should do two things. Okay, if after sleeping with him, and we are not talking about paid prostitution, she is sort of, let's say, tempted to see him, she should have one strategy. If, she doesn't want to see him, she should have another strategy. Now, if the guy at the end of the night, gives her a little bit of money, saying, oh, girl, you're so nice, buy yourself some nice dress, whatever. In the second case, she should just take the money and go. Now, if she wants the guy to see her again, she's advised by other girls to go and not buy something for herself, but to buy a watch for the rich guy. Now, you can imagine why buy a watch for a rich guy who probably has more watches than he needs. The idea is that if the girl is showing self-restraint, which means not buying something for herself, but something for the guy who doesn't need anything, she's showing that she's not after his money. Now, I thought that at the end of the London riots, an interesting thing would have been if people who have been looting all these, consumer objects, they would have brought back all the objects to the doors of the corporations or the shops and donated them back, as a kind of a gift of compassion, just we were looting them temporarily and now we are returning them back. But then I was afraid that maybe corporations would start quickly filming, this procession of, goodwill and use it in the next advertising films. Now, until very recently, I thought, of course, that success of ideology of choice in some way has been, that it kind of focused on the fact that choice is an individual matter. And in some way it has presented, the individual with possibilities of possibilities, and especially sort of advertised sort of the possibility of really making it. So the idea that everyone can make it, that was very much part of ideology, which, as I pointed out before, pacified us and sort of helped people not to focus on sort of social disadvantages. Now, as I mentioned before, this ideology heavily relied on the idea of guilt and inadequacy. So, turn to self-critique, self-destruction, self-restraint in regard to abundance of consumer goods was sort of at the forefront. And that self-restraint often prevented people from engaging in social critique and also from kind of attempting to think about choice as social choice, as a mechanism that can bring about social change. Now, even sort of those kind of consumer-related riots in some way did not question that change is possible. However, for any social critique to be effective, it is necessary to reinterpret the idea of choice and therefore open in any way possible space for new visions about how society in the future needs to be organized. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. And we're having a short Q&A session. So if anybody has any questions, we'll be happy to entertain a few questions.
Sorry. Thanks for your lecture. There is a word that you haven't mentioned at all in your presentation, is the word fetishism, which is a kind of excessive attention to whatever matter. Do you think that it's something adequate to, relevant to the idea of narcissism and also to the consumer society that we're living in?
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. The idea of fetishism is really, really crucial. Now, there have been sort of a lot of studies, writings about sort of consumer objects and fetishism from sort of psychoanalytic and social point of view. And I didn't want to sort of focus on the problem of fetishism, because we would end up debating, of course, a lot about sort of perversion, and that would be an important debate about, sort of what is the logic of perversion in today's society. But rather, I thought that would probably, lead us into quite a new lecture, I guess. But it does appear in my work quite a lot. I must say, this question of fetishism, and especially the link on perversion. In the context, of what is the social change, and there, as maybe those of you who work in the domain of psychoanalysis know, there has been a lot of debate in today's society whether a social change happened in the way that we have more of a kind of a problem with psychosis, and whether we also have a kind of a more generalized type of perversion. And there are some lines of thought in the French psychoanalytic Lacanian school which go in that direction, that there is a certain kind of turn to both psychosis and perversion, while other terms, especially in more sort of British Lacanian term, would be that no, that we actually shouldn't be too pessimistic. So I'm sort of happy to speak a little bit more about that, but I would maybe give some chance for other questions, and otherwise sort of maybe return to answer you more thoroughly.
Why? Hello. Maybe I want to ask a question for the artists. Maybe because the ideology can function itself through the function of the object of the art, which the big art can include all the signifiers within the symbolic order. And some of my artist friends ask me, how can artwork undermine the function of the big art, and to maybe we can we can realize, and to let the public realize we can have encounter our chance but not choice. Because when we encounter the real chance, which is the maybe the inconsistency of our future or our reality, that we will feel very anxious with that. But how can we overcome that? Artwork can help us overcome that. It is my question for artist friend.
Thank you for this question. Since we are sort of invited here by Parasite, I will be happy to answer you a little bit with a longer answer. Now, in my lecture, when I mentioned that Jeremy Hutchinson, the idea of asking for a failure and then presenting that, I thought that in a wonderful way attaching precisely that, kind of a contradiction inside of the capitalist process, work process, actually denial of a certain failure, and when it's an exposure of something that it has to be hidden, for the market economy to function in the way it does. Now, about sort of what I kind of excluded from my lecture, but I will show now the images where I was thinking in this direction where you asked how artwork provokes us to look at these objects, or even anxiety-provoking objects. I was sort of thinking about the work that maybe you know of Anthony Gormley. Now, when Anthony Gormley in London, New York, and some other cities created this project, Event Horizon, he was putting the statues on the top buildings. Now, immediately when these statues were, this is from London, this is from Hayward Gallery, and they were, everywhere on the bridges and so on were these statues. Now, of course, it was hugely anxiety-provoking when they emerged. The first feeling was that maybe it's a human being committing suicide. So people were calling to police stations like crazy, Then, it became a fascination. Everyone started searching for these objects, So we started seeing our public space differently, looking for something we don't usually observe. A certain object appeared which perturbed our usual vision of the space. At the end, it was really interesting when the time came to put the objects away, the statues away. There was a huge internet debate about what will happen with statues after they are removed. There was such an anxiety that they will not be treated in the right way. So people proposed that a special park should be created for the statues to unite themselves, so that they will not be lonely anymore, that they will have a kind of a society of statues. And, when this anxiety of, the lonely statues emerged, I started remembering that in the mid-90s, an Austrian artist had also the ideas that statues in South Austria, which are on the bridges, they are called Nepenuks, are lonely. So he asked for the permission to unite these statues for one day. And people were very happy, an identification with statue, sort of provoked thinking about loneliness in some way in their own midst. So we can see that artwork provokes certain kind of thinking, via a detour, via the object. Now, when Anthony Gormley got a response about the anxiety and statues, his own response was another artwork, which he did in Australia, in Melbourne, and that's called the memes, and he created a minimal type of statues. Now, his idea was that when we walk, they are tiny, and when you walk among them, you as a human are in a godlike position. Now, what he was interested in is also when every statue is created of the same sort of number of sort of elements, but with tiny little changes, he created a total different emotional responses towards them. So his idea was, how can an object change us? How can an object actually provoke a different kind of emotional response, and who are we as subject in regard to the space? Now, when I saw his project, I was interested also that in some way art opens us also to open a new perspective. So these minimalizations that happened in his work reminded me, I don't know if you have seen the film Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. When the scientist, by coincidence, when his experiment goes wrong, he shrinks his children. A whole family setting suddenly is visible in a new way. When parents almost eat their children for breakfast, or vacuum clean them and so on. All through this trauma, suddenly a whole, kind of structure of the family is seen differently, and, actually when they are kind of growing again, it's a kind of a happy reunion in a new way. Now, a way of seeing differently, which I think art opens, happened also, I think last year was this, when the exhibition in New York, New Museum, showed the work of Carsten Hiller, and he allowed people to actually see the exhibition, not by not seeing it, to go through this, slide from one floor to another, Then he asked people to take pills, which we didn't know that they are empty, but it created a certain anxiety when you are in an exhibition space and asked to take a pill. Suddenly a whole problem with your body and anxiety emerged differently. But the best part was when we were asked to wear glasses where the whole reality was turned upside down. So I did this. And for 2 hours I was there with my son seeing everything upside down. Suddenly you start seeing reality different. So when I exited, I saw this, I thought, what are these guys doing observing me? It took me some minutes before I saw that this was just a truck and advertising picture on it. So, in some way, with this little kind of vignette, I hope I answered to you that art in some way gives us a perception of trauma, anxiety, by opening another angle of view.
I think it's a matter of the dynamic between the virtual reality and the reality of the virtual. It's a matter of the dynamic between the virtual reality and the reality of the virtual. Yeah, the reality of the virtual, which means the real in a Kantian sense. How can we encounter the real by the supplement of the object that they are? I think it is the way for the artist to think about how to provide a condition for us to encounter something real.
Yes, and as you know from Lacanian discourse, the real emerges usually as a surprise. It doesn't have an image. We try to attach a certain image to it, but it often escapes any symbolization and any sort of imaginary image that we create of how it looks. That's why the power of art is really often in the surprise, in the shock that it creates, and in the fact that it opens precisely the space for the operation of the real, which you wonderfully described.
I noticed that you have a different way of describing the 2011 riots, 2011 riots throughout the world. Maybe some people will say insurrections during that year. I noticed that you call it as consumer-related riots.
Only London riots, not other.
Not only London.
Only London riots, yes.
But is that a trend or just an isolated case?
I would not relate other riots like Egypt or other countries in the region, in the Arab world, as consumer-related riots. I think definitely they had an important political agenda. But we have observed consumer-related riots already in the past. Even in the 90s in the United States, they had numerous kind of consumer-related riots, which also, of course, had a political tone. So one of the important ones in the 90s was where the riots related to Rodney King, a black guy who was an innocent black guy who was beaten by the police, and the secret camera recorded that beating. And at that time, for example, it was the black population going to the streets, rioting, and the political, of course, outrage at some point did at that time also turn to consumer riots, which means that they went looting the shops which were selling sort of the desired consumer object like Gap jeans or television or other computer shops. So definitely I think that we should not ignore the fact that many sort of political uprisings get some kind of a consumer rage as part of how they are expressed. London riots, I did not think that they had a kind of a political momentum in them. They were much more sort of related to sort of a certain kind of rage in regard to sort of inequalities that were related to sort of consumption at the end. Of course, they started again with an innocent man being killed by the police. That is a very important moment there. But later on, mostly it was kind of a desperate rage of very poor people. And when I, for example, remember reading comments of the riots, they often said that they had nothing to lose because they don't think that they will live long. And horror, in regard to these riots was the response of the police, which was unbelievably strong, and the punishment that this youngster got was, so severe, uncomparable with other punishments, for other crimes, and of course uncomparable to the crimes that at the same time, the financial elites were committing and are still committing. So it was unbelievable punishment, where the idea was also to punish the family, not only the youngster who was writing. So the idea was that, for example, poor people living in social housing, the whole family would lose their house, and that's the horror, which we know the punishment of family, even from mainland China or anywhere else, where sort of people, the family even needs to buy the bullet for the person on the death row. Or, we know in Palestinian territories that when children are punished, the whole punishment, is actually the punishment for the family.
I asked this question because it looks like this theme of this theory of choice or forced choice is in parallel with this idea. This is the first time I've heard this idea of consumerist right. So these two clues lead me in the direction of thinking whether there is a kind of trend or trend that is driving the explosion or even the emancipation force into a kind of dead end, because in my understanding, this topic of choice, liberalist choice, is a kind of dead end devised by the capitalist system. So I'm concerned with the possibility of this kind of right being kind of consumerized.
Thank you. This is a
also related to your idea of this new idea of democratization of luxury. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very helpful question. One of my ideas in my work on choice has been that a certain change in the perception of subjectivity happened, where the subject became perceived more and more as consumer, and not anymore an empty subjectivity, kind of a Kantian subjectivity, which is sort of the basis of even the idea of human rights. So instead of the subject being the one who has rights, we started perceiving the subject as someone who has choices. And that's it's a very important change, because the subject who has rights, this abstract empty subject on which, even sort of the ideas in the past of contemporary democracies were based, doesn't have rooting in nature or in culture. That's kind of where, the Kantian subjectivity is crucial. And also, in some way, we have, the idea of human right is basically that regardless of, my wealth or sexual orientation, whatever, I, as this abstract subject, have rights. Now, when the subject becomes someone who has choices, we have the consumer subject who has to have means to make choices. Now, I observe this tiny shift already happening in the 70s in the United States in regard to the question of abortion. At first we had a debate that abortion is a right. Suddenly it became the right to choose. It becomes a choice. And also at that time, when you have a change in the shift and the shift in the discourse, at the same time we also have a legal changes in regard to whether the state can pay for the poor people to have abortions or not, and we have the Supreme Court decision in the mid-70s, the decision that no, Medicaid shouldn't be used for abortion, which means that you have to pay for the abortion. And of course you have this idea, that only some people, really are those who can choose, and also the question of what is the right choice. Here the right choice, of course, has been, very much debated in regard to abortion. So the subject is a consumer. That's the traumatic thing, and in the dominant ideology, and which is why it's not surprising that the riots are really going in the direction of consumption instead of the fight for human rights. If we look at the ideology of human rights, this ideology has been really sort of kind of pushed aside. The fights for human rights, we see very rarely the debate about human rights. Very recently I spoke with my friend actually, who is one of the judges of the European Court for Human Rights, and even his idea was that more and more decisions of this court, one of the rare courts, is about thinking about rights in the context of culture, distinct kind of organizations of society, and so on. Let me give here one example from my home that can be sort of consumed for a long time, and it became more and more linked to an abstract logo. Where object actually is not so important anymore. It's the logo that we identify with, and of course, when we are wearing a certain logo or participating in a certain ideology linked to some kind of a logo, we are also, first you have this illusion of democratization that everyone can participate in this community related to some kind of a logo, and we also have a certain kind of a detachment of the logo from the object. That's why you can have like a fake Prada T-shirt, with the writing Praga, and you are participating in a certain kind of an ideal of what this logo stands for. And that's where in the history of the studies of luxury, they point out that a certain kind of a democratization happens. Also, the value of the object changed. You just have more and more, luxury not linked to a particular object. You have experiences, much more of luxurious experiences, or sort of even luxurious, of course, vacations can be an element of luxury, and a certain kind of participation also happened with the way mass consumption sort of way happens. And in here, fake goods and copies are very important. That's why we know that some big corporations actually are not fighting against the copies, because every copy is the best advertisement, or they would, give extras of their goods for free to the poor communities in order to create a certain kind of addiction to the object, or in order to propagate the object. In regard to luxury goods and London riots, there was actually a very interesting way how the companies reacted. Now the big companies like Adidas, Nike, Levi's, they were horrified by the fact that mostly their objects were stolen, and the fact that most of the rioters were already dressed in their clothes, this kind of gangster chic which was propagated, and the jeans and so on. So they were horrified against. Now, the younger, small companies were delighted that their things were stolen, because this was propaganda for their logo. So there was a kind of, I thought, an interesting contradiction. But both were playing on transgression as a part of the advertising, especially the kind of the gangster chic thing. The rappers they were using as part of the advertising are still using, who have a lot of problems with drugs with law or whatever. And you know, transgression and luxury, as I mentioned, always go hand in hand. From early times, where you know the tulips were the objects of luxury, you were there. Even then, you had to steal them to give them value.
So thank you, Renata, once again for the talk. I think we had a good session. We have tea and coffee, so if you want to help yourself to it. And also, if you want to leave your email addresses, and also we have a talk on Wednesday and the conference in April as well. So keep in touch.